Warning: MultimediaJay radio style contains controversial content, strongly voiced opinions, and uncensored bluntness. Listener discretion is advised.
And now, the show that really tells it like it is. MultimediaJay radio style. Here's MultimediaJay.
Good morning, Internet. I am recording this before the rest of the neighborhood wakes up. I did not sleep in at all on a Saturday morning because I really didn't feel like it. I'm not really having sleep problems at all, so I'm not behind on sleep or any of that sort of stuff. But I wanted to record this because last night there was a bit of a problem in the neighborhood with barking dogs. I think what was going on was there were some lazy asses getting drunk, and the weather was nice, so they just left their dogs on the balcony of their apartment. It was after dark. If anything at all spooked the dogs were basically dogs. I just hope that they were brought in before the end of the night. Oh man, some people and their pets, let me tell you. But hey, you know, I live out in hick country. I should expect this sort of thing, right? Likewise with the loud trucks and the loud motorcycles. Regardless, happy Saturday, everybody. This is MultimediaJay radio style for Saturday, February 25th, 2017. I want to keep things a bit more low-key today, not only because of how quiet I want to keep things, but because, you know, this is going to be a moron discussion, so it's a follow-up to what we were discussing about Ryzenmania earlier, and as usual, the moron rules apply. Well, I kind of just spoiled it right there. The moron rules apply. Whenever there is moron in the title, that sounds like moron. So the question is always, who are the morons? And I'll tell you who the morons are. The morons are those people who insta-disliked my skepticism towards Ryzen yesterday, even though I'm not totally opposed to the processor. I'm just trying to be objective about this sort of thing. But when you get 3 dislikes from haters, fanboys, etc., so close to when you turn a video on YouTube, it's a dead giveaway that they didn't watch the video. They didn't listen to any of the points in my podcast, and therefore just, he's skeptical about Ryzen. Dislike! Knee-jerkers. But you know what, folks? Already I'm being proven right. And it's fun to be right, because it's fun to win. Seeking Alpha, a business-focused website that also looks at technology and things like that, has some of the most critical articles about AMD and Ryzen. As predicted, this is not going over well with the business community. One in particular that I was looking at yesterday was AMD regains ground, but for how long? I think there's going to be a bunch of links in the description that go to these articles, and besides the usual geek links. But basically what's going on is, over the past 20 years or so, AMD has had these hype spikes, but they always crash shortly afterwards. The original Athlon, they actually won over Intel there, and there was a spike and it crashed, and there was some more stuff with some of the Athlon XPs, spike and a crash. Then there was Athlon 64, spike and a crash. Things have been dead, but the trend has been that the spikes are getting smaller every time, and their prediction is that Ryzen is going to be the lowest spike of them all. And there's some other things, too, that the Seeking Alpha folks are bringing up that nobody wants to talk about, even as people are all ooey and aye on here. Basically, all the big tech channels are going, wow, Ryzen, amazing, amazing. Well, there's more to the story, and the business community is already picking up on this. But why should I expect any kind of healthy skepticism from people with no background in the Fortune 500 that have been doing YouTube videos or their whole career? So it's like, I got news for you. Big companies take a very different approach from Joe Computer Builder building his latest gaming rig, and some of what AMD is doing with Ryzen is inherently antagonistic to that big of a market. Here's another article from Seeking Alpha. AMD Zen, now Ryzen, on 14 nanometer for 4 years? Ouch! especially when Intel is poking away at 10 already, but AMD's not even going to make a move until 2020. Of course, I really don't care about the lithography at this point if they can make the chip efficient, but there's also the financial side of yields from silicon wafers involved there. It's not just about whether or not the processors keep getting better, it's about what it costs to make them and what you can get after you spend your labor dollars and whatnot at the place that makes them and things along those lines. The last article as well from Seeking Alpha is AMD Stumbles on Ryzen, which is talking about the stock price, because investors are already skeptical and they're already antagonistic, and the prices are probably going to make that worse. Just like what happened with Polaris, which is exactly the thing that I was talking about yesterday. But one of the big things is they reference back to PC World, an article from February 8th, that there is no official Windows 7 support for Ryzen. Congratulations, AMD. You've just lost the business community. I hope you can sell a lot of gaming PCs with Ryzens in them. But if you make an extremely efficient Ryzen that the business community can have in corporate workstations, you need to have Windows 7 support. I know it's the Windows 10 era. I know Microsoft is pushing all over the place for Windows 10 to become everybody's operating system. I know that Microsoft is doing that. I know they don't want people sticking with 7, but that's not the way corporate IT works. It's a completely different world when you're talking about IT in a business environment. It is very lowest common denominator, and it is not surprising for companies to run a software package or even hardware configurations completely into the ground and not make a change until what they're using goes end of support, which for Windows 7 won't be for another couple of years. Windows Vista went end of support, or is going end of support this year, but Windows 7 has a few more years on it. Windows 7 goes end of support in 2020, which is roughly the time that if Ryzen succeeds, AMD would be releasing a successor chip. This is a mistake that costs them a large market segment because corporate IT doesn't like unsupported stuff. Corporate IT doesn't like taking guesses. Corporate IT likes sure things, which would be, and it would be a sure thing if Windows 7 was officially supported for Ryzen. If I were AMD, I would have supported Windows 7 on Ryzen or Ryzen on Windows 7 this time around, and then the successor chip would drop Windows 7 support to coincide with when the business community will probably be abandoning Windows 7 in droves. But here's the thing. One of the strategic things that I have heard Lisa Su and the other folks at AMD talk about is getting rid of all those darn sockets and all those darn architectures and having Ryzen scale up and down from low power stuff all the way to the world of servers. They want everything to be Ryzen in some way, shape, or form. So what's the plan for business PCs? Because I'm telling you right now, businesses are not going to be deploying gaming towers. And given how businesses like to run an OS into the ground, it actually, even if they were to buy Windows 10 era computers, they would most likely be downgrading them to Windows 7 until Windows 7 was officially end of life and everything was retired company-wide. That's the way it is in my neck of the woods, and that's the way it is in numerous other companies as well, because corporate IT runs off of a different philosophy than people building their own gaming PCs. In many ways, it's the total opposite. It's sheer tenacity and trying to avoid problems as much as humanly possible when you have all kinds of workstations all around a giant corporation. It really does change the rules quite a bit when it comes to managing the costs of all of that. Even things like the overhead, how much power the systems draw, can be a factor. But this is the thing. If this basically means that there will be no Ryzen business workstations, they've lost that market. If they will not officially support Windows 7 over at AMD, they need to support Windows 7 for this specific Ryzen family and then drop it next go round. I do hope that they change their mind on this, because this is an opportunity lost at this point, and considering the strategic direction is to put Ryzen everywhere they possibly can in order to get back into the ring with Intel on this stuff, it really, I don't know why I'm even having this discussion. But anyways, yes, Seeking Alpha and the business community they're skeptical towards the Ryzen, and they're probably the single biggest source of skepticism. If you want the part 2 of the story on Ryzen, get away from the system builders on YouTube and look at the business analysts who are like, okay, AMD, what's your long-term plan once the hype train runs out of steam after this processor releases? Now, the balance of this discussion will be focusing on the things that people were not happy about the last time I talked about this sort of stuff. Beginning with the fact that I am doing exactly what I said I would do and not getting a Ryzen, but I am interested in Raven Ridge. There's no concentrated coolness in me even getting the Ryzen 1700 right now. I am graphics card limited more than CPU limited at this point. It's not enough of a leap to justify once again dropping money on the guts of a whole new system and then having to find a new home for the Skylake board, not to mention Windows 10 license. I mean, what are we going to do about that and that kind of stuff? But I just don't feel like having this year be a repeat of last year when it comes to new hardware for Monolith. The more compelling reason to spend any decent amount of money on PC upgrades is the graphics card. I started with a 1060 for efficiency's sake to get my foot in the door with Pascal because my old Kepler card was a complete power sucker with the extra auxiliary power jacks and the whole 9 yards. This was to get my foot in the door. I think the long-term solution, ultimately, the 1060 would be better paired with the Phenom 2 in Tuxedo. So I am looking at what AMD puts out on the market with the Vega release coming up later this year. As far as Ryzen is concerned, my first Ryzen experience will be on mobile. The Raven Ridge, the APU, the mobile APU that's supposed to have enough punch for a laptop to be a console killer, will basically, yay or nay, one of my biggest things that I've been curious about for the last couple of years, going all the way back to when I purchased the turd Shiba for business trips. You see, I've noticed the trend among hardware manufacturers to make anything that says gaming overpriced and overly styled. You have so-called gaming PCs that look like something out of a sci-fi movie, but leave a little bit to the imagination in terms of how easy they are to work with if you want to fix your own system. That super expensive Gigabyte PC with the automatically opening flaps for cooling is a great example of that. It's kind of like in the world of industrial equipment. The minute you can call something industrial, that's an automatic excuse to jack the price. I think that calling something gaming is doing the same thing in the world of computers. Which is why you will never see me purchasing a gaming laptop, because I think it's a gimmick. I think a gaming laptop is a money sink, and it's a desperation move to take advantage of people who want to look like they're all techie but haven't thought things through. You see, what we call gaming laptops nowadays used to be referred to as desktop replacement laptops, a label that's not quite as sexy, so to speak. So you have gaming laptops nowadays. They cost a lot, and they use buzzwords like GTX this or something like that. But you look at the numbers, and the mobile versions of these CPUs and GPUs don't pull in the kinds of numbers that their desktop counterparts pull in, even if they have the exact same name, number, whatever attached to their name. So it's a marketing thing more than anything else. My real curiosity with laptops, though, is when I bought the turd Shiba in 2015, I was supposed to take some business trips that would have me away from home for days or weeks at a time. So I wanted something that could play games in low mode out of my Steam library in the hotel rooms. So basically, I went around and looked at what was available, and the word on the street was that even though AMD was losing as far as processing power goes, the systems on a chip that they were putting together that had landed them all those deals with the console manufacturers basically meant that if I picked up an AMD APU laptop, it would have stronger integrated graphics than any Intel offerings. So I did, and yeah, it's a decent Mullins era APU. It plays a few games if they have a few years on them in low mode, but I'm wondering when these systems on a chip on mobile devices like laptops are going to become console replacements and defeat the purpose of a console replacement PC, which is the sort of thing I've been hearing about. Oh, look, build something that crushes the consoles for the same price. No, that can't be your final destination. That has to be your starting point. The real reason to build a console killer is because you want to get into PC gaming and have an upgrade path. It's not just about, I built something that's better than a PlayStation 4, and then you call it that. The story can't end there, because the concentrated coolness of PC gaming is a better experience than the consoles. And the consoles are releasing hardware updates with things like Scorpio and PS4 Pro. So it's not just a matter of, I beat the Xbox One with my computer. No, you gotta have an upgrade path in mind. And the key thing is, stop buying whole devices and just buy parts. That's where the real benefit of building your own computers and fixing your own computers comes from, when you're not buying entire systems and paying for parts that you don't need. Even if you start out by taking a relatively reasonably industry standard OEM box, like an Asus, or I was looking at a few other computers earlier, not Lenovo, that's got some proprietary stuff in it, but you find, actually Acer. Yeah, I saw some Acers earlier that looked interesting. They looked like they were standardized enough for that to be a starting point with a Windows license, and then you start upgrading parts and not buying entire systems and parts you don't need. But that's why I'm curious about Raven Ridge. For the people that want a console replacement without an upgrade path, I think the laptops are about to steal that thunder from the desktops. It's just a matter of when there's a mobile chip out there that's powerful and efficient enough to serve as your console on the go, so to speak. And it would certainly be easier to carry it with you than my console replacement desktop tower. Raven Ridge is how I'll get into Ryzen world later this year, but I will skip the desktop stuff for now. At some point, though, I imagine there will probably be an efficient Ryzen chip that I'll want to see how much performance I can squeeze out of, and then I'll do the processor upgrade. But right now, Monolith is more due for a graphics upgrade than anything related to regular CPUs. Next point of contention. The points that I made in Intel is its own worst enemy apply to AMD Ryzen as well. That's true. What is a Ryzen? It's a processor that is taking on the high-end i7s, just like the Phenom 2 did with the first generation i7s, but I think the Ryzen will be more successful if, say, those benchmarks in the presentation weren't cherry-picked earlier this week, because we know we've certainly seen AMD do well with Ashes of the Singularity on the graphics card side of things. So we just got to see what happens when individuals not affiliated with AMD or some kind of media, something or another, that might be under a cushy-shushy, don't say bad things about our product agreement, get their hands on this chip, start making YouTube videos about it, and start testing it. But ultimately, everything that applied to Intel in terms of their latest high-end stuff, not really having enough concentrated coolness to get people to abandon older hardware, that can apply to Ryzen as well. Ryzen, of course, is an improvement. If these numbers are to be believed, then it is definitely a decent improvement. But do you need a Ryzen for 1080-60 gaming? Or would you get into... Ryzen is being marketed as a performance enthusiast part. It's not really a mainstream anything. There are some SKUs, though, that scale things down, but Ryzen is really doing a top-down thing in terms of AMD's marketing. So, if there's not a lot of concentrated coolness in Skylake and Kaby Lake versus Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge, and maybe there's a frames per second difference, but you can still get 1080-60, for example, out of a Sandy Bridge or an Ivy Bridge, the same things that would apply to Kaby Lake and Skylake apply to Ryzen. Ryzen is a high-end processor, but there's games out there, but for the past several years, actually, it has been more than worth it to upgrade your graphics card rather than your processor. That's why we have projects like Germ Gaming's Potato Masher, where he's taking an original Core i and running it straight into the ground, as seeing how long it stays relevant. And then there's Potato Masher Pro, and then there's, of course, Greenham Gaming's incredible i5 Dell, which was a Sandy Bridge 2400. I mean, they're not the only YouTubers that are doing stuff like this. It's all over the place. There's people saying stuff like this about Sandy Bridge. There's people saying stuff like this about Thuban. There's people saying stuff like this about the Phenom 2s, like the one I still have in Tuxedo, which I just got a new motherboard for. It overclocks very, very stably up to the range that I had it crashing at last go-around, which tells me the Gigabyte motherboard was flaking out, and it was never the processor that was the problem with that system. But actually, Tuxedo, when it gets the GTX 1060, I'm pretty curious as to what exactly I'll be able to do with that thing, despite the advanced age of the processor. And again, the common so-called internet wisdom floating around out there is, you don't need a powerful processor to game. The Ryzen is a powerful processor. Ergo, you don't need it. But I'm sure that internet folks won't mind a little hypocrisy because, wow, it's Ryzen! But you can see where we're going with this. I mean, there's people out there making Sandy Bridges still be relevant nowadays. There's people out there making Phenom 2s still be relevant nowadays. And if you can get gaming performance on the cheap from like a decommissioned corporate tower, like those Optiplexes I was looking at earlier for Sandy Bridge Dellosaurus, then what do you need a Ryzen for? Why do you need to build a new system? Why do you need to get a new Windows license or something like that? Because Windows 10 still has the most gaming support. Linux is making ground. SteamOS is making progress, but by and large, I see people talk about building Steam boxes. They're talking about dual boot, or Wine or something like that, because they still want the Windows ecosystem for all those games on Windows. So it's any other time besides this pre-launch Ryzen hype, it would be a lot more socially acceptable to make points like this. Or should I say any other time when it's not AMD, it's suddenly more socially acceptable to make points that you don't even need a new processor to get 1080-60 gaming performance. Now, you may want to turn to Ryzen for things like beyond 1080 or 4K, but even then, it comes down to what are you seeing? What kind of frames do you need to generate? What kind of display are you using? How big is it? How far away are you from it? And basically, what do you need to get an acceptable image? If you want to, of course, turn off all the efficiency stuff and go full-on performance to get good benchmark scores, well, you're trying for a high score. But in the real world, what exactly do you really need to get performance that beats out the consoles and gives you a proper frame rate with a proper graphics setting that looks appealing and plays appealing on today's hardware? Probably not something with a Ryzen. And when Intel drops their prices, if they're smart enough to do so, the stuff that's almost but not quite Ryzen will get cheaper or competitively priced or something like that. But that's what I've really seen over the years. Regardless of whether or not there's competition with AMD and Intel, it seems like there's a certain price tag associated with a certain level of performance. I've looked at the APUs, the AMD APUs, then the FX series, then the Intel stuff, and it seems like it's a sliding scale. So, I mean, once the prices stabilize, I think we're going to be back to that. And one of the biggest points about the launch prices, yes, Intel will be cut down a notch or two, but ultimately that point's going to go away, and you're still, well, why would you want a Ryzen unless you want a Ryzen? So, I'm very curious what Intel's strategy to counter this is going to be, unless, they're going to let AMD do this, because they're in markets right now that AMD is not really focusing on. So that's why we're hearing from Intel about things like machine learning and NAS chips and things along those lines. And likewise with NVIDIA, as AMD's Polaris and stuff like that has mounted to something in the world of graphics, and the RX series has basically carved a niche for them again in the world of graphics to compete better with NVIDIA. Now suddenly we hear about NVIDIA processors in the Nintendo Switch, or NVIDIA processors powering cars or something like that. I mean, sometimes, companies move on and like, okay, the other guy who doesn't have anything in these new markets wants to take the old one, fine, have it. Of course, I don't mind competition for gaming PC parts, because whatever brings down the price and whatever gives people choice and whatever encourages better quality, because monopolies aren't good for any of those, it's all good for the consumer. The difference is that I am not going to immediately assume that Ryzen is an instant win for AMD, because it's not. They need to execute, they need to compete, and they need to win before I can break out the bubbly on that one. I hope that they can amount to something with this Ryzen thing, but I'm not celebrating until they actually do. The final point that I will reinforce here is a point that I don't need to defend at all, because it stands on its own no matter how much people hate me for it. And that is that consumers will benefit in ways beyond AMD competing with Intel. See, everybody's talking about this as AMD climbing back into the ring, AMD's competing with Intel, that's gonna make things better. But that's not the only way that's gonna make things better. AMD competing with Intel, of course, is going to, if there's a price war of some sort, and not just the price war, if there is one, where Intel stuff gets knocked down a peg in terms of price because Ryzen competes with it, but also the old stuff on its way out. Like if you want to build an FX system to get your first experience with building computers, if those prices drop because that hardware goes on clearance because it's nowhere near competitive with anything from either AMD or Intel, I mean, this is the time to start building something. Build one of those systems where you are sinking most of the money into the graphics card because the processor is just going to mosey along because it's the old construction era chips that were never very competitive. competitive, and AMD had to sell them cheap in order for them to sell at all. They're about to get even cheaper. But, you know, that's one of the principal complaints. I can't get into PC gaming. It's so expensive. And up to this point, you know, there have been people that have talked about buy a refurb, convert an OEM box, da-da-da. You know, benefit from the group discount or the bulk discounts of an OEM for things like Windows licenses, hardware, etc., and then upgrade your way to a gaming rig. But now, you know, when this stuff goes on clearance, you can build the whole system from scratch and get all the joy of saying, look at me, I built it all myself. And the only regular retail price you'll pay, if you don't go gray market with it, is for the Windows license for Win 10 or what have you. Of course, gray market secondhand options exist. I don't encourage them, nor would I use them because of little gotchas and things like that from reading the fine print. But there's people out there that swear by sites like G2A and Kingwin. I won't join that party, nor encourage others to do so. So yes, in a situation, if you didn't want to take the risk of some of the inherent issues with gray market Windows keys and things like that, you would spend closest to regular price on Windows, and that's it. So you'd still end up with a competent gaming machine. If it may not be very efficient and it may lack some horsepower, but it would get you in the door and you could upgrade your way past that. Now, this is the part where folks are like, what about an upgrade path? A desktop or a tower or a gaming machine does give you an upgrade path. The thing is, what sticks with your motherboard and what doesn't? And this is the kicker here. Yes, you'd have to buy old RAM and stuff, but for the most part, processor, motherboard, RAM, I call those guts upgrades, because RAM is the one exception. For time and again, it has been my experience in 15 years of building computers that those two tend to go out at the same time, that you're not really interested in a new processor a couple of years later when there's new technology, new motherboards, new USB standards, things along those lines. So if you end up with a system that has no upgrade path on the guts, get a nice video card. And then when you finally decide to put that system out to pasture or repurpose it for something that doesn't involve gaming, you take the graphics card with you, and the meat of what you spent to have a future-proof system was in the parts that don't have to stay with that cheapy motherboard and processor that you got on clearance. So, I mean, there's just these other things that people are not talking about. That's why I am talking about it, even if it gives people a headache. Quite frankly, it is absolutely absurd that I even need to have these discussions, but you know how it is with people and bandwagons and how uncreative people just feel the need to ride everyone's coattails instead of doing something that's cool on their own, by themselves, that's actually their own idea. But I would rather go against the tide on this one, because there's enough people out there that are singing the praises of Ryzen, that it has come to save us, that it is so amazing, and I'm over here like, let's not pop the cork on that champagne until it actually does succeed. In the meantime, there are lots of things that are about to get really good for consumers and people who previously would have been intimidated out of building a gaming PC. Keep an eye on the numbers. We'll see what happens, and I'll be glad to join the celebrations when and if this processor succeeds. But I'm not celebrating a single second before it does. Thanks for listening, everybody. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.